Congressman Casar, welcome to the program here. The legislation that you introduced this week seems like a long time coming, almost, or actually 3 years to the date since those widespread outages across Texas. Why now, though?
Texans are sick and tired of every time there's a heat wave or a big winter storm coming for everybody to be checking to see how the grid is doing. It's time for us to make common sense changes in response to Winter Storm Uri to make it so that folks know that the lights are going to stay on. And the two biggest ways we can address that are one, weatherizing and upgrading our existing grid infrastructure, and then two, connecting the Texas grid to our east and to our west. And we know that that works because 3 years ago to the day during Winter Storm Uri, places like El Paso, which is actually interconnected to the west, and Beaumont, which is actually interconnected to the east, did not suffer those massive power outages in the same sort of way that the rest of the state that's isolated did.
As you know, the Texas grid was created like this by design. Is this something Texas? Let me rephrase that question. As you know, the Texas grid was created like this on purpose. Is this something though Congress can legally require the state to do?
Absolutely. The US Congress and the federal government already require ERCOT, which is Texas's grid, covers about 90% of Texans. The federal government already requires ERCOT to comply with reliability rules. So we already set a baseline standard as a federal government on making sure that your electricity is reliable. But what we learned during Winter Storm Uri and what we're starting to see every time there's a heat wave or a big winter storm coming is that ERCOT isn't reliable. And so we want to upgrade those reliability standards to say, in addition to the current standard that already is required by the federal government, you've got to be interconnected with the other states because it just doesn't make sense for Texas to be the only place where people aren't able to pull in power from our neighbors when we need it the most. I mean, think about it for a second. When other parts of the country are in trouble and have a big winter storm, but we have plenty of power in Texas, it creates a huge economic opportunity for us to sell our surplus power out and help our neighbors. And when we're in trouble, we need to be able to pull in power from New Mexico and Arizona and Louisiana and get help. And that'll make sure that consumers don't have that big price spike and that the lights stay on. It's called supporting one another. And that's something we believe in as Texans and something that we believe in as Americans.
You've also argued that by connecting Texas to the national grid, that would help Texas meet its climate goals. Explain how that would work, though.
This bill would also, the number one reason for the bill is to prevent blackouts for everyday Texans. The next best reason for the bill is that it would prevent that kind of price gouging that we saw from some of the biggest energy companies during the blackouts. So those are the biggest reasons. But there's additional benefits of this bill. It would be a boon for rural Texans, especially for their economy, especially around the clean energy economy, because there's nowhere in the country that is windier and sunnier than in Texas. And there is real opportunity to develop more clean energy in rural Texas. But right now, if you develop that kind of clean energy, you can only sell it to our fellow Texans. By interconnecting with the national grids, that would create the opportunity for us to be an energy market for the rest of the country around that kind of wind and solar. So we know there's actually a lot of pent up demand out in the country for Texas wind and solar, but we have to interconnect to be able to sell it out there.
Well, let's talk about money. How much would this cost? And then secondly, this secondary market. I mean, Texas could really see more investment, I guess, if it starts selling its power nationally.
Right. So to both questions, first of all, the current isolated grid is costing us billions of dollars. Just in the heat wave of 2019, a study was done and it showed that we were losing hundreds of millions of dollars by not being interconnected to the grid because it's costing everybody these jacked up electric costs. If you think about it, we have a system set up of energy scarcity. And that is wrong in the energy capital of the country. Why do we have a system of scarcity? And in a place where we supposedly support business and trade, we actually have walled ourselves off from the rest of the country. So this could be a real economic boom for us to be able to sell power when we have surplus power, which is most of the time, and we can develop that really easily on a lot of the empty land we have in Texas. And then second, save ourselves billions of dollars. Some estimates from the University of Texas show that over the next dozen years, if we keep on dealing with these extreme weather events, which everybody knows we're going to keep dealing with, we could lose $20 billion or more as Texans if we're not interconnected. But if we're interconnected, we will save ourselves those tens of billions of dollars.
And lose that money and businesses not coming to this state is part of the concern I know many people have. Who would manage the grid, though, under this scenario? Would ERCOT still exist to manage the grid?
ERCOT would still, this would leave the state legislature still able to decide who manages the grid. And so the state legislature could keep on having ERCOT manage the grid. The difference would be that ERCOT would have to be interconnected to those other grids. That's the major change we would make. Now we know that in the past, there have been some who have argued that they want to stay disconnected, despite the fact that they know that being disconnected makes the power go out more. Even though being disconnected hurts our economy, they argue, let's stay disconnected, let's stay independent over Texas patriotism. Well, I'd rather just keep cheering for Texas football and Texas barbecue as my form of Texas patriotism and not stay disconnected. Another argument we hear from opponents is they want to stay disconnected because they don't want the big bad feds involved. Well, let me tell you what that level of federal regulation is. If you interconnect the grid, really two things come into play. The federal government would have more of a say in planning on how interconnection across state lines work, because we really govern in that area of interstate commerce so that it's more clear how we're interconnected. And two, the federal government can make sure that our rules around just and reasonable rates for consumers come into play. And I know that may not be the favorite thing of big energy companies, but I think for Texas consumers, having an additional layer of protection to make sure they're not getting screwed or price gouged on their electric prices, I think that's a good thing.
Congressman, you would obviously need Republican support to get this passed. What do you think it would take to get some of your conservative colleagues on board with this?
I think that even though this is starting off as a Democratic bill, we will eventually get this passed into law as a common sense, everyday people agree on this sort of bill. It's an infrastructure bill.
But how do you do that, though? I mean, you just laid out the reasons why Republicans wouldn't support it for patriotism and federal oversight.
Well, I didn't say that they wouldn't support it for those reasons. What I'd say is opponents, I think that's the reasons they've leaned on in the past. That's the reasons that everybody leaned on before the winter storm. But I think we can hold on to Texas patriotism, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, independent, or apolitical. We can hold on to Texas patriotism and have an interconnected grid. I think that that's just fine. So I think that people will eventually let go of some of those ideas that were really pre-Winter Storm Uri ideas. And I think those are going to fade away. And I think those are going to fade away as everyday people keep on getting those alerts on their phone about the fact that they need to turn off the AC because it's getting really hot and the grid could collapse. I think people are going to start saying to their legislators, look, let's find a way to deal with this. I think ultimately also that the economic interests, especially in rural Texas, will start being really clear than in places like rural Texas that are largely represented by my Republican colleagues, that they will have a huge economic benefit from interconnection. And so it will take some time, but you've got to start with a bill. And there had never been in the history of the United States Congress a bill to have Texas interconnect. And we finally have that bill available in front of us. It was the first time it's ever been drafted, the first time it's ever been filed. And I do think it will eventually make its way into law, because when you've got common sense, economics, the life, health, and safety of folks in the energy future of our country all aligned, I think eventually people across the aisle will come together and do the right thing.
Let me ask you one last question about the mechanics of how this would work. If this were to happen, would Texas remain a deregulated market?
Texas would still be able to have its unique kind of market, which is different than in many other parts of the country. The new regulations that would go into place would be essentially three. One, you've got to be interconnected. Two, federal government is going to work with Texas to develop a plan on how to make those interconnections best work so that we can sell power out and bring power in. And then three, the federal government would have more of a say on just and reasonable rates. And so those would really be the three changes. I think that many of the other areas in which it's more of a free market kind of energy economy with a wholesale market would not be impacted or changed. We can continue to have debates about which regulations make sense, which ones don't. I believe that total deregulation has not served consumers and everyday Texans well. But I also do not believe that we should have a completely controlled market where there isn't competition. In fact, this bill would create a more competitive market where you would have more options for everyday Texans. And it would actually create a more competitive market in the neighboring states as well. So when we talked a little bit about how we think we could get support to get this bill passed, I believe that people, members of Congress in states nearby Texas, will actually come on board and start supporting this when they realize that bringing Texas power into their markets and having more competition and more options there actually could also protect their consumers from price spikes when there's a hurricane in Louisiana or a wildfire in Arizona.
Have you reached out to any Republican colleagues yet about this?
I've been talking with them about it. We've started having some preliminary conversations. We don't have Republicans yet on the bill, but I feel very confident that more and more Republicans across the country will start getting on board with interconnecting our grids nationwide because it's just good economics.
Congressman, certainly legislation we will be watching. Thank you for the time.
Thank you.